Hello and welcome to Note to File, a clinical research podcast, a collection of interviews, candid commentary, and general tomfoolery for the clinical research industry. Check us out at notetofilepodcast.com. Without further ado, on to the show. All right, welcome guys to a very special Note to File podcast, not our normal Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern time. First, what's up to my always effervescent co-host, Denali? How's it going?
Oh, it's going just peachy.
Beautiful. And let's get kicked off. Excited to have on the show Tyler Van Horn, CEO of Science 37. Tyler, how's it going, man?
It's going great. Thanks awesome. For having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to have you on. I've always wondered a lot about Science 37, so nice to have you on where I can ask you some questions. And if you're in the audience, again, feel free to throw out any comments or questions you might have. And let's kick off like always. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, Tyler, kind of your journey through the clinical research industry, maybe how you got in, and let's hear.
Yeah. Happy to kind of give some background. I mean, so I originally, many years ago, started in the finance world. Was kind of in the asset management, investment banking world. And, what got me into clinical research was always interested in kind of, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, that whole space. And frankly, I just got really tired of people around me that I loved getting sick and either, passing or, going into remission. I had both of my two grandparents. One had MS, the other one had pulmonary fibrosis. One passed of heart disease, chronic heart disease, and then the parents had cancer and whatnot. And so and an aunt passed of a stroke. And so got really tired of that. It happened in a very short period of time. So made the jump into clinical research then. Started out in the CRO world. A couple of different things there. Was in clinical business, commercial business, technologies business, real world evidence business, and then kind of saw the gamut, if you will, and then came over to Science 37 in 2021. And so a little bit of a different probably entry point, but my experience was largely more intrinsically motivated than anything else.
So were you even like throughout your CRO stint, was it more of the like on the financial side or more like operations even, or sort of how did you?
Yeah, so I went right to operations at the time. So I wanted to get into more of kind of hands-on, be closer to patients. Being a little bit naive to kind of how clinical research worked back at that time. Came into it was Quintiles at the time. Came into operations, kind of a quasi role, both financial as well as operations, and it kind of geared more into the operations side as it kind of moved along, still kind of with that underlying financial component of it, or that base, if you will. And so kind of moved through that, was in various different roles, a lot of strategy roles, and kind of thinking about more broad, big picture kind of questions that we were looking to answer. And then, came over and was here to Science 37 as the, running strategy at the time. And did that for a couple of years. Then last year kind of got into the commercial world, apparently, opening your mouth too many times and, asking questions leads into, hey, let's maybe go out and try and ask these questions to the market, and, be a little bit different in that aspect. And then stepped into this role end of last year, October, November timeframe, which was it's been really rewarding so far. I think there's it's no secret that we've had a journey past, and it's been rewarding, kind of just having those conversations, and changing the perspective.
Yeah, and yeah, as the sort of still relatively new CEO. I imagine that certainly comes with its share of baggage, maybe, for lack of a better word, considering what everyone's seen about Science 37. But I do want to ask about the history of Science 37 to an extent, and correct me if I'm wrong. I know my recollection, what my first knowledge of Science 37 was really like a siteless trials was sort of the tagline, like, to begin. And it seems like that's changed a lot over the years. So, I mean, what can you kind of tell me about the background or maybe a little bit of the, history? I mean, it's been 10 years or so though, right? They've been around for a hot minute.
Yes, it founded in 2014. So, almost 11 at this point. And that is where it was founded, is siteless trials. Mixture of technology and people to be able to do that. I think, big lofty goal, big lofty vision on that side. I think there's some very, very, very few trials that are fit for a siteless trial. And so, it was a great vision at the time, I think, in practicality of where clinical research is and ultimately where it's going. It probably doesn't fit into the vast majority of trials. So that was kind of where it was founded. And then 2019, I think, right before the COVID pandemic, there was an appetite to start developing technology and being both a siteless trial / technology company. And I came from a technology world previous to that, and there was a lot of players in that technology space, and so
There still are.
There still are, and it's growing. And I think there's points of differentiation for some, and then some, not as much. At the end of the day, it's largely about the quality that what's there. So we went on that journey, and we're trying to build some technology. Spent a lot of money, as everyone has seen, doing that. And it's a very crowded space. And frankly, it wasn't what we were good at. The underlying of what we've done and who we are has not changed since from the beginning. The modalities of deployment have adapted, but ultimately, kind of where we want to get to is hasn't changed much at all. And so, we went through that journey. We spent a lot of money in technology. It just wasn't a great fit. Also, during the COVID pandemic, everybody was DCT. Every element of everything was DCT. So, any remote data collection, before the pandemic, e-consent was a e-clinical solution, or falling under a bigger, whatever term was being used at that time. Some of that fell under DCT if you had telemedicine to it. And so it just kind of got really, really muddy in there for a while, what DCT is. And I think now, coming out of it, it's been a little bit more interesting, if you will, to see kind of how the landscape has changed of different, groups that do DCT and what that ultimately means. And, where we really come to and where we really fit in is, we're a direct-to-patient or decentralized clinical trial site. That's what we're really good at. That's what we've done from the beginning. And we've done over 170 trials with that. And so underlying the whole time, we were doing what we do best.
That's not me, is it?
No, I don't think so.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can now. Yeah, you're back.
Yeah. I don't know where we left off, but that message got lost a little bit along the way of who we are and what we do. So we're a clinical trial site at the end of the day. We operate a little bit differently as far as how we do the conduct of a trial. And frankly, not every trial is a fit for what we do. And I'm not, not naive to that. And I think it's for very specific trials that are a fit, it provides a lot of utility. But we're essentially a site that fills in the white space around existing, clinical trial sites to patient populations that otherwise wouldn't have access to clinical research. If, because they don't live around a site. There's a lot of utilities to that, a lot of benefits to it. We operate and we send a nurse out into the patient's home. We have our investigator team. We have all of the things that you would expect of a site to have and do. We just are collecting and enrolling patients differently. And so it's been a unique, kind of interesting journey from the siteless trial kind of days to technology and some of the other things and the murkiness around the market and who does what. And now we're just, we're trying to get that message out there and trying to, really share it, because what we ultimately find is when we're participating, working on a site as a trial, is that the patients are incredibly thankful for the opportunity to participate. And they stay in the trial. We have, on average for all the trials that we run, we have a 92% retention rate. And so it's the utility and the underlying aspects of it are there. I think it's somewhat to our own detriment. We muddied the waters a little bit along the way.
So that's what I want to kind of ask about. I mean, maybe because you weren't there in 2019 when this kind of all kind of happened, but I see this a lot where companies sort of try to diversify, for lack of a better term, to reach farther than they really maybe should or could or can do successfully. What do you think? Why do you think that happened, or do you not know at this point? Like, what drove that sort of?
Well, I was curious. Do you think like going public via SPAC was problematic in some ways? Because then, I mean, that does put you in a different position than being a private company, right?
Yeah, and I think it was about timing ultimately at the end of the day. It was post-pandemic, endemic stage. Interest rates were down significantly. Money was cheap to go and raise, and the opportunity to go public via SPAC and raise more sums than in the private market just seemed appetizing at the time. But as many SPACs have found, in hindsight is always 2020. That's not always the best move. There's a lot of legal components around SPACs that make it really difficult to operate, and then also just being tied to quarter to quarter results when you're not diversified, and you have more risk exposure as far as like one piece of the business. It gets really complicated, on a public stage, it really is difficult to kind of change the narrative. Or also, obviously, as a public company, there's things that you can say and there's things that you can't say. And so you have to draw that line and be very careful. In some ways that definitely was more difficult to kind of get the message out there. And so we've being a private company has really, really benefited us in the last over the last, I guess it's almost been a year now. No, it's actually been over a year now. And so it's really benefited us in the near term, because it's allowed us to focus on delivering great results for our customers and not worried about public investor set, right? And so hindsight's always 2020. At that time, it seemed like the right move. I don't think anyone saw at that point in time inflation going through the roof and money becoming a lot less cheap. And I think there was writing on the wall. I think no one knew the extent at which it was going to ultimately play out that way, and ultimately that hurt. And it's really difficult to do and manage through that while trying to do with the other things. So in hindsight, I'm glad it's behind us, is I guess what I should say. And I'm excited about kind of where we're going and the opportunity that we have in front of us.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, it makes perfect sense for a number of different reasons. And I kind of want to dig in more into like what exactly you guys do, because I've always been sort of curious, and again, I know there's been pivots throughout the years, or a little bit of change of focus maybe. I feel like it's always been tough to get my head around it, because I know, like, we've worked on trials as a small site that I've seen Science 37 work on. I'm very much with you. I think like there are a ton of types of trials that make perfect sense to like fully decentralize, and some trials that oftentimes sites don't they don't really want to do. I know that sounds bad, but we know dragging a patient to a site is not always in the best interest of anyone, the patient or the site for that matter. So it makes a lot of sense in a lot of cases. So for you guys, do you have any like physical sites, or do you partner with local sites? I guess, can you kind of walk me through what that looks like? I guess maybe that'll help me wrap my mind around it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll kind of just start from the beginning, is that we're set up like a site. We do everything very similar, if not the same as a site. There's a little bit more complexities to it, starting us up as a site, and a lot of that is just an educational component to it. The majority of trials that we work on are where we are doing most, if not all, of the clinical conduct out of the patient's home. And so the utility is that you get much bigger catchment, obviously, for a trial. But we are very transparent when we're looking at a protocol if we can or cannot do something. We're never going to do a biopsy out of the patient's living room. That's just not going to be. That's not what we do. And so, but we've come a long way as far as the trials that we ultimately can work on, and the things that we can do out of a patient's home, depending on trial design, and ultimately kind of what that yields. And so we do. So I'll come to your question about working with sites in a moment, but we start up as a site. We recruit differently than a site does a little bit. And I can go into that. But we ship IMP directly to the patient's home. If it's got temperature monitoring, we use TempTales, all of that collected in our source. And we have investigators, full team of investigators. We've got specialists as well as broadly licensed internists that are licensed, in 48 states, typically up to 50. And then we have our clinical research coordinators. We've got a large team of nurses around the country that can get to the patient wherever they might be. We ship and distribute all of the logistics as far as kits and study supplies and things like that out of our headquarters here in RTP, Raleigh-Durham, and we ship those to the patient's home, and we coordinate all of those activities so that they can be done and show up in the right time to be able to complete the visit. All the things that, a lot of people, there's some misconceptions around it, is like, we can do blood draws and vital signs in the home, and that's it. We've done some more complex procedures. There's things that we can't do in the home, obviously, as I mentioned, but we've done some more complex procedures out of the home as it relates to kind of, some more of the subjective CNS scales. We do a lot of that. We've done some, research, or I should say, more of like a validation set, looking at kind of how it compares, and if there's any bias in the data relative to the way sites operate. And there's been no material difference. We're doing spirometry out of the home using MasterScope. We're doing a ton of different things. And so all that is conducted, encapsulated within kind of the site, and then the investigator provides oversight. Typically, our investigators spend about anywhere, depending on the trial, 30 to 50% more time with the patient because it's providing the oversight out of the home. And so we do a lot of work associated with that. Where there is utility, and we've been doing this for years, and it was kind of the DCT guidance kind of provided some more credence or credibility to it. We do, in some cases, if you need a bone scan or an MRI or something like that, where it's standard of care. There's radiology clinics located around where the patient's home. We can go out and send somebody to that clinic and get that scan done, acquire the imaging or whatever it might be, the medical record if necessary, and bring that back into source. And so there are areas in which that we work with sites. We've also worked with sites in the fact of there's a number of trials out there that the first or second visits are with a more invasive procedure. And so standing particularly around, surgical trials where there's the initiation is on site. And, often sponsors are flying patients around the country to be able to do that. And then doing the follow-up from, out of the home. Those are a little bit more complex when it comes to delegation logs and 1572s and things like that. But as those, we see some more like that, where it's the follow-up and especially if it needs a physical exam or something like that, it's making it so that they can pull from a broader population for those types of trials. So we do work with sites in that way. The other way we work with sites, and this is kind of probably more this on the recruitment side, because we are nationally oriented, and so finding patients and enrolling them wherever they might be within the U.S. We've had to develop a really strong recruitment capability. And Brad, I know you and I have talked about the hundreds of patient recruitment vendors that are out there these days. So we've developed a strong patient recruitment capability to identify patients across the country. Because as a site would do, they have might be treating those patients and be able to kind of pull them from their existing database. We've developed a database over the years, but when you're talking about over 300 million people, there's a point in which we've got 6 million people in our database today. There's a point in which that you need a lot more to be able to identify patients across the entire country. And so as part of that, we've developed that strong recruitment capability. And we'll work with sites where we will do recruitment, central recruitment this is something we started doing in the last couple of years or so. We're doing central recruitment, but we're not just doing the advertising and tossing patients over to a site after they've done a pre-screener that is simply against inclusion/exclusion criteria. Because we are a site, we really focus heavily on the qualification aspects of it. And so we take it a step further and really design that screener that the patient's ultimately self-reporting into, getting them to sign a medical record release form and acquiring the medical record prior to them ever to going to a site. And in some cases, we'll actually review that medical record prior to going over, because especially for trials that you can use the medical history to identify eligibility, taking that burden off of sites and helping kind of get to a place, because what we're hearing is that it takes about 2 to 4 weeks to chase a chart from other if they're referred from outside. And we've invested heavily in that area of acquiring records, and we can do it in about 3 days. So, if it takes 2 to 4 weeks to acquire a chart, the probability of that patient being able to be recontacted goes under 5%. And so we've seen a lot of utility with, doing kind of the medical record acquisition and then taking a step further with the review to ensuring eligibility before ever sharing them with the site. And we do that for a lot of trials where it might not make sense for us to operationalize it as a site, and it maybe not fit in the model, but it's not something we do exclusively for those trials. We do kind of we like to call it a dual enrollment pathway, either from home or out of a site, and being able to provide folks the option to where they choose where they ultimately want the care to be conducted.
Do you find our sites generally open and collaborative, or do you find that sites are sites can be standoffish, or what the hell is this? I don't understand. What kind of vibe do you get? Because I think it can depend very much on the site model or whatnot, and whether they see this as competition or collaboration. You know what I mean?
I think so. It's mixed, but I would say it skews more towards the positive end. And I can go into both. On the positive end, I think when a site is on a trial and they're receiving referrals from a recruitment agency, and they're receiving hundreds of them potentially, at some point they just give up, because they're searching for a needle in a haystack still. So when we're sharing basically a fully qualified patient based on medical history, they're very thankful and excited. We've had some sites saying, this is fantastic. We have an advertising budget and we're identifying patients locally. Can you do this medical record pull for us and help us, right? Essentially. So we get a lot of that, especially as it relates to, like I mentioned, kind of the loss to follow-up rate as time goes on. And so that's, we get a lot of good comments in that area. Still, though, when let's just say for a nice round number, there's 100 sites on a trial, still only roughly anywhere between 70 to 80% opt in. And so some are just not interested in working in that way. As it relates to kind of the site and how we ultimately operationalize the site for some of those trials where there might be initiated on site and done after the fact, those are largely sponsor-driven decisions. And so, we're very collaborative, and, what works best is obviously a peer-to-peer conversation with our, investigators as well as the investigator on site, to kind of walk through and explain how things work on a little bit more granular level. And so that works very, very well. But there's still some resistance here and there. And I think part of it is because sites have gotten burned in the past. It's no secret that sites are being asked to use the technology stack that's that's insane for every trial. And then you're running 30 trials, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of different technology that you need to use. And so I think there's some, especially with DCT and some of the elements there that have been deployed from a technology perspective, it's been a compounded issue. And so as part of what that the resistance in any sites that do know who Science 37 is and kind of the technology journey that we've been on, it's kind of, again, reframing and re-explaining what we do and how we ultimately fit in.
So what percentage of, like you said, you act on the trials, you do some of these trials in their homes, what percentage of those are you then just doing sort of recruitment efforts that you actually aren't involved in as a site? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, less than 10%. I mean, most of them, the special sauce of Science 37 has been the site and always will be our site. We had to develop a strong recruitment capability out of necessity, not because we had the general aspirations to become, a leading, recruitment. And we partner with, recruitment organizations all the time as well. And so there's some trials that, our recruitment capabilities aren't a great fit for, and we're happy to go find and/or partner with, someone that does have, more specialist capabilities. Yeah, most of them are on the site, and the results on the site are where ultimately the benefit is.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Do you see? I mean, have you seen any changes over the last maybe year, especially since the DCT guidance has come out, in terms of are sponsors generally more open to decentralization, or less because the market's been sort of wonky with some of the DCT vendors? I mean, what's that sort of looked like over the last, especially I guess the last year? I know you've been there. I know you've been acting CEO less than a year, but I'm sure you've kind of maybe gotten a little bit of the pulse.
Yeah, so I think the DCT guidance has made people curious. I think is kind of my overarching thought to it. I think in general, we came out of this huge wave out of the pandemic, and everyone was, full force on DCT. Then we kind of had this, trough, if you will, of, we have other options now, so we're going to go back to what we were doing. But where we often find ourselves, kind of fitting in is that there's a lot of interest in DCT. I think, again, it's like assessing what ultimately DCT is for a trial. There's, again, technology which you can enable sites with. There's some cases where a trial can be fully decentralized. To be perfectly honest, we only see those within late phase trials where it's fully decentralized. But most of the time, we're acting as one of many sites on a trial. And so when you think about it that way, if a trial is applicable from to be able to do that, there's generally interest in being able to do it. I think sometimes it's let's stand up our sites and let's come back and have a conversation in 6 months. And if we're not enrolling the way that we expect we're enrolling, then we can have, let's get going. That's how a lot of our first time conversations go, which is, we expected to be, here and we're here, like we need help. And so then we end up, being added to the trial as a site in a little bit different capacity. But
you guys get a lot of sort of rescue business, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah, a lot of rescue, and then what that ultimately yields is, it's once you kind of try it once and kind of see the results, it's now the thought is, how do we actually design a trial to be better fit for purpose for this kind of model? And so we see a lot of repeat sponsors kind of looking to do it, especially ones that have harder to reach patient populations. Some patient populations where you can't stand up enough sites to be able to get the catchment that you need for a rare disease or something that has very narrow inclusion exclusion criteria.
Yeah, if I'll tack on to Nelson's question here. What's up, Nelson? He's in Boston. But yeah, are there, to that end, are there specific therapeutic areas that you guys seem where it makes the most sense, or is it more by phase, I guess, or what does that kind of look like? I could see that.
Yeah.
Tracking rare disease makes sense to me, right? Because you're not going to have necessarily any one population in any one place that's going to be enough to fill your study up.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So rare disease typically makes up a composition about 30% of what we do at any given point in time. We, from a specialty perspective, you know, we've seen, at least from the last couple of years, we've got a couple different areas, and it's going to seem like I'm listing off a bunch, but respiratory and pulmonology have been, really, there's a lot of interest there, and because that space has become very competitive as far as different folks running, very similar trials. Cardiology is a big aspect for us, CNS as well, and then more recently oncology. Oncology, and it's not, not every study, absolutely every not a study is fit in oncology for what we do, but it's becoming harder and harder and harder to enroll an oncology trial. And so,
I mean, those trials, I mean, we're relatively newcomers to oncology, I would say. We're running probably 10 to 12 like interventional oncology trials. But yeah, I mean, those criteria are so insanely specific. And we have sponsors who are even, we're like, look, we've only seen a couple of these patients and they still want to give you an award. And I'm like, that says a lot to think about how hard it is to find those patients.
So my question on that though is like, understood they're super hard to find, but how about like the trial actual like design and execution? Like how does that work in that decentralized model?
Yeah, so typically first line therapies are not great in oncology for what we do. Second and third line therapies are better suited. We partner largely and a lot with the treating oncologist. And so there's a couple different ways that you can kind of think about it. First is, partnering with that treating oncologist, and they are referring a patient into. So we don't do any standard of care, and so we partner with a lot of research naive provider groups that they want to afford their population the ability to access research, but don't necessarily have the infrastructure. And so they refer into Science 37. And there's a couple of different ways that they can stay engaged. First is just referring into Science 37 and staying abreast of anything, especially as it relates to if they need to continue doing standard of care, which is most often the case. We do sometimes, depending on the trial, is add them to as a sub-I on the study if necessary. So from a design perspective, that would require anything that needs to be done on site. We can kind of wrap around the existing oncology, treatment that they're kind of going through and support from a research perspective. And so the bifurcation there is what is standard of care versus what is ultimately being done and conducted for research. And so I'm not going to, sugarcoat it. It's challenging, but it's not something that's outside the ballpark, especially like we've seen a really interesting uptick in it, because it's, to your point, we've only seen a couple of these patients. Like we got to try something else because something else needs to be done. And oncology patients are frankly expensive to find. It's just a reality. And with the different cycles, it could be a very expensive trial to conduct as well. And so it just ultimately depends on there. There's some obviously that are more simple around diagnostics and things of that nature, but that's kind of the challenge. And I think the more we've learned on that front, there is definitely utility. I think it's an area that we need to look at doing more into in the near future, because it's there are elements of engagement on the treating oncologist to be able to, engage them better and work with them better. It's something that was in the DCT guidance, but no one's really doing it incredibly effectively. And I'm not going to sugarcoat that we're the best at it in the world, but I think there's more utility there, more opportunity to kind of dig in and understand how that can be of more utility to patients and providers, throughout.
That's going to be another sort of question along this, is that's a lot of engagement with, putting a lot on the patients and the providers to be involved. What is the reception experience that you've had with those folks coming to them and say like, hey, we want to work with you to work with your patient or work with the patient themselves? What's the reception from those populations that you're?
Yeah, there's definitely some that are very motivated to do it, and there's some that are not motivated to do it. It just depends on ultimately what the provider and the conversation that happens. And so it depends. It's always the answer of it depends, right? But
I feel that.
there's more opportunity there. Ultimately, a lot of it comes down to education and helping them understand what is the benefit for them and what is the benefit for the patient that they currently are treating.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of, you mentioned sort of an area you want to get into, maybe more into oncology. Where do you guys see Science 37 going in the future? What's the direction you're taking it now?
Yeah, so I mean, we're doubling down on our site and building out capabilities. I have aspirations to run, some, in the future, some more clinical validation studies to be able to perform broader assessments out of a patient's home. I think that's of utility in general, not only for clinical research but just for healthcare in general. And so there's aspirations to do some of that. Ultimately, it comes down to is like my motivation is providing, and what we're ultimately kind of going towards is providing universal access, regardless of where somebody wants to participate. It can be at home, it could be at a site, and there's elements that need to go through it. Oncology is a big area that is it's important to me. It's important to a lot of people. But it's not something that is like the core end all be all of what Science 37 needs to focus on. And so, it's enhancing some of the existing stuff that we do with scaling quality in a model like this. And so, as you continue to do more trials and are conducting more visits out of a patient's home, quality is the number one, and patient safety is the number one thing that we're focused on. And so, as we're thinking about kind of what that looks like, it's making sure that we have the right pieces in place, leveraging technology the best that we possibly can, and then frankly enhancing the ability to identify patients that are interested in clinical research, which is one of the most costly things to be able to do. And you make some assumptions at the beginning of a trial and not all of them materialize. And so trying to make sure that we can be much more data driven, and most of what I'm thinking of as far as investments in building Science 37 is investments in data, both in interoperability of data and the data science to be able to have more predictive kind of outcomes as it relates to what motivates somebody to participate in a clinical trial. Ultimately, at the end of the day, is there a cluster analysis, if you will, of folks that are more motivated than others to participate in clinical trial, and what is the motivating factor? And so trying to understand that a little bit more nuanced on the identification side is going to be really important, because it's already difficult enough to most folks as peanut butter spread, but being very, very targeted and tactical about it is ultimately what we're trying to get to there. So that data aspect is going to be really important in the next 2 years, and then beyond that, it's looking at kind of ultimately maybe at some point in the future we do have a brick and mortar kind of not necessarily traditional site footprint, but something where that there is that gap of assessments that can't be conducted out of a home and you need an exam room or something, a facility to do it, kind of creating a hub and spoke model off of that. One of the biggest cost drivers of our model is going to be, and it's what makes us unique and different is getting the IMP to the patient and having that nurse go into and from the patient. That's where we're ultimately are different from a costing perspective, and so making that more scalable is going to be really important.
Yeah, I can imagine that being challenging. And then a somewhat interesting question from Ashish. What's up, Ashish? Curious about the current state of tech stack and you guys actively commercializing it externally. I thought maybe that was something I had heard at some point. I don't know if that's true or not, or kind of where you guys are in that, if you're able to kind of share it all.
I'm happy to share. There was a lot of noise around tech stack at Science 37 a couple of years ago. We do not build technology. We do not sell technology. We are a clinical trial site. And that is like, just to underscore it. It's, and I think that's where we kind of, there was some distraction, right? Both from who we are and what we do. But at the end of the day, we're a clinical trial site. And so we're not commercializing any technology as it relates to, and the technology that we did build was largely akin to a decentralized eSource. And so, that's the technology we had built. It had other elements to it. It had eCOA embedded. It had eConsent embedded, telemedicine embedded, all of that. But that's not something we're looking to commercialize. I think that's, there's a lot of different solutions out there for all of those different things. And in most cases, where it's technology that's purchased by a sponsor, they already have their options selected. And it's very hard to displace existing providers and differentiate, because a lot of it is based around experience and what's there. And so that's not something that we do, and that's not something we have aspirations to do. We're focused primarily on executing clinical research in a decentralized fashion through an end-to-end clinical trial site. We still have eSource and all of the things necessary to run it. We don't use any paper in our model. It's all digital. ISF. I saw some of the posts yesterday, Brad, about some of the e-binders and some of that component of it. So we use all. We don't use any paper source unless for some reason the assessment calls for it, and then we have a way to do certified copies and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But everything is digital, and so we primarily are using best of breed technologies now to execute, because then we can take advantage of upgrades versus the expenditures that we would have to upgrade our own technology. It is simply just not worth it, and it's not scalable over the long term.
Makes sense to me. So Science 37 is not a tech company.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Tech enabled service.
There you go.
We are not a tech company. If you had to fit us into one of those categories, but we are not a tech company. No.
Yeah. I mean, that alone, I think clears up a lot for me, not knowing over the years sort of what are you guys. But I think framing it that way is good and probably important for you guys at this point. I think that just that question leads me to believe a lot of people are confused. Yeah,
I mean, I remember the first time you and I chatted, and you said, "I've talked to hundreds of people over the last 3 years, and nobody can tell me what you do." It hurts a bit, but it's not surprising. I have to say, and that's where we've, in the last couple months, and over the course of, frankly, I guess the last year, have really been a little bit more fine tuning that and trying to be more descriptive about it. It's a lot of education that goes along with it, but at the same time, it's changing the perspective and changing the mindset. And I still laugh at when you said, I told you what we did, and you were like, why didn't you guys just say that for the last 5 years? It's frustrating, but at the same time, underscoring it's really important that that's what we're focused on as a company. Which is highly different than what is currently out there in the DCT space, and even so much so that we're the only ones that have been inspected by the FDA on 3 pivotal studies in our model, and walked away with no 483s or material findings, which we're incredibly proud of for 2 reasons. First off, any site should be incredibly proud of if they walk away with no 483s or material findings. But second, it's the first of it. It's the first of its kind. And that was, we're very, very proud of that.
Yeah, no, that's no small feat, especially again. And I had a FDA auditor come in and basically made very clear to me in a short amount of time she had no knowledge of the decentralized trial guidance, and I was kind of like shocked. So yeah. I think there's probably not even a strong understanding in the agency about how some of those things might work, which I assume if they're auditing you guys, then they probably find some people who know what they're doing. But again, I think just how poorly understood it is.
Yeah. was supposed to last 3 days. It lasted 10 because it was a lot of education.
Explaining, right?
Yeah,
I could see that.
Exactly. So, but we were thrilled with the outcome, and continue to be thrilled with it. And it's a focus. It's the number one focus of what we do.
Makes sense. That's it. One more question. We're getting kind of down to the last little bit here, and so it's up to Dan Schell. Aside from tech, I mean, what would you say is probably like the biggest misconception people have about Science 37, other than confusing it with Science 38?
Yeah, definitely confusing there. I think the biggest misconception, aside from kind of the tech and some of the history associated with it, is what can actually be done out of the home as far as a clinical assessment, right? As part of the schedule of assessments, which is something I didn't hit on earlier when we were talking about therapeutic areas. It really comes down to, in those kind of focused therapeutic areas, and we didn't get through all of them, but we kind of talked about a few, it comes down to the schedule of assessments, if we can operationalize it in our model. There's a misconception around, the use of home nurses to do these assessments and the level of complexity you can get to. Like I said, we've done some pretty complex assessments out of the home. And so as from our perspective, it's an education challenge, and that misconception of like, you can just do blood draws, AEs, and, ask some questions around CONMEDs and things like that. It's much more than that. We're doing physical exams out of the home. We're doing, the gamut, we're doing one trial right now, we're doing UPDRS out of the home. Like it's stacked. So that's one misconception. And I think that's the biggest misconception of what can be done. And the reason why we can do that is because all of our nurses that support patients out of their home are our employees. It's a really important underlying fact about what we do. These aren't agency nurses or home healthcare nurses. These are research grade, trained by our investigators, trained in, they go through an onboarding process, and they're ultimately signed off by one of our investigators before they ever see a patient. And that's how we maintain such high standards of quality. And so that's the big misconception that we do. We overcome that kind of and talk about that. Well, if we can do it in a conference room, we can do it in someone's home. So actually going to a sponsor, to a CRO, and actually doing a visit right there in a conference room and showing how things actually work when a visit is being conducted out of the patient's home. That's been really impactful to kind of show, versus just tell with some pretty marketing infographics about the actual care that we provide.
Yeah, and I've talked a lot of smack throughout the years, but I believe that 100%. Like, there's a lot that can be done that you don't need a site for. Now, obviously, if you're doing colonoscopies for an IBD trial, or you kind of hit on some of the other examples, yeah, you're in a different ball game. But even then, it could make sense to potentially supplement existing sites and partner, with outpatient endoscopy centers, whatever the case may be. I think there's a lot of ways forward, and ultimately, we all want the same thing, right? We want better treatments to get to more patients by getting more people involved in the clinical trial process.
That's exactly right, and I couldn't underscore that point more. And we're, like I said, normally, if there's 30 trials on a site, we're just one of them. We just operate differently. We operate alongside other sites, because sponsors who want to bring their KOLs, they're gonna want to bring a lot of things along the journey, and they have a lot of requirements. And so, but there are things that can be done, in tandem, right? And so I always look at it as a spectrum. Is like a hybrid trial is a trial where some of the assessments are completed remotely. A decentralized trial is where all of the patients and assessments are completed remotely, and like kind of combining the two is what I would say is a hybrid decentralized trial, which is, some of the patients are seen on site and some of the patients are seen remotely. We largely operate in that kind of middle section. We can flex up, and we can obviously do a fully decentralized trial if that's the ask. But like I said, we only see most of those in kind of a long-term follow-up scenario where you're following up with patients for 15 years, from a parent site and being able to, ultimately kind of follow them if they move from Arizona to Florida or to New York. You can follow them with 50 state licensure over that 15-year duration. That's where we see mostly fully decentralized, to be perfectly frank, but the majority of what we do is phase 2, phase 3, and we're one site of many. But
yeah, I think that's a good, I like your definitions there in a way of the, like, it's like hybrid decentralized, where I feel like that seems to be the most appropriate in many ways. Because again, I think you're not going to get rid of sites entirely. But again, I think there's a space for both of those things depending on the needs and wants of the patients. And yeah, makes perfect sense to me.
I don't think you can't get rid of sites, right?
You're not getting rid of me, damn it.
Yeah, no.
You might.
Yeah, no. I don't anticipate that's going to happen. No, I think there's a opportunity to run things in parallel, and provide more folks the opportunity to participate. I mean, the results of what we do speak for themselves. We just wrapped up a narcolepsy trial where we enrolled over 50% of the participants. We did a PBC trial last year that we did a public release on, where we did 47% of the U.S. enrollment. And that is, and that could go on and on with like a list of 10, but there's utility in what we do, and it's largely centered around opening patient catchment without compromising quality and the data that's being collected. And so that's really where the focus is and what we do. And the other side of the benefit of that is affording people the opportunity to participate in clinical research that don't live around any sites, and would want the opportunity to participate but don't ever get that opportunity. Rural populations, things like that are largely I'd say untapped or not afforded the opportunity to participate, and that's where we really focus, is kind of filling in the white space, if you will.
Yeah, again, makes perfect sense. So yeah, we're in the last 5 minutes. So yeah, I mean, I just want to take a minute to thank you for coming on. Does take some balls, come on and talk about this stuff when there's been all kinds of stuff in the background and sort of what Science 37's been through. So I mean, I do appreciate that, and I do think, I certainly have a much better idea of what you guys do, which maybe it doesn't matter, but everyone else listening, can have a better idea of what Science 37's up to. Any sort of anything you want to close with? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, the first thing is thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk about it, because I think there's been it's been a journey, to be perfectly frank on that. For every one person that knows what we do, there's 15 that have no idea. And so, I think the opportunity to talk about it and kind of, set the record straight. And I appreciate you kind of making this a platform in which we could do that. Closing thoughts. We talked a little bit about this at one point. Is that I think curiosity is the most important thing to me, and being the willing to learn about something different is going to be, the most interesting thing for the progression of different modalities to conduct clinical research. Again, our solution is not fit for everybody. It's just the reality, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. But that doesn't mean, because it might not be a fit, that we don't want to learn about new things. I always kind of say that, to learn, you've got to be curious. And to be curious, you have to be willing to learn. And so, as it relates to what we do in Science 37, is that there's a opportunity to kind of change enrollment and change the patient access landscape for the better, without all the operational headaches and complexity. And so for me, closing thoughts, just to underscore kind of what we talked about, not a tech company, You know,
Heard.
yeah, we're always one step behind Science 38, and
Just one, though. Just one.
one step, you know, one digit, if you will, and you know, it's. I look forward to kind of seeing how everything plays out and the change that ultimately can bring, both through partnerships, but also just advancing research for the better. And that's really what it comes down to for us at Science 37, and what we believe in, and why people get out of bed every day.
Oh, well said. Tyler, thanks again for coming on. Denali, who do we have coming on next week?
I believe we have Chris coming on from
Chris
Proof Pilot.
from Proof Pilot. So you guys tune in next week. Tyler, thanks again.
Yeah.
And until next time, thanks, guys.